Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Cokerhook. And I have a special guest with me tonight for this show, a gentleman who's deep in the heart of Texas, actually, and a friend and a colleague of mine, Mr. Danny Morning, who's a communications instructor at both St. Edward's College and at Texas Christian University. And we're going to talk about some very interesting things here relative to this great concept of communication. Danny, welcome to Reference Point.
Hey, Dave. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm really glad you're here. And you and I have known each other for a little while, but this topic of communication is something that I'm very interested in, and especially with what has gone on in the last 12 weeks or so. We just had our national elections last Tuesday, and all of that theoretical communication that was going on between parties, and there's just been a lot of stuff going on. And I am of the opinion that people talk a lot, but they don't necessarily communicate. So I was wondering if you could actually define communication for us.
Well, it's funny that you say that. Communication scholars typically fight about this concept that you cannot not communicate. You have behavior, and then within behavior, you have a subset of meaningful exchange. So really, communication is an intentional process, right? And it's not just two people expressing their ideas, it's two people exchanging these ideas in order to make meaning. Some scholars discuss the concept that rhetoric is epistemological, or we come to know what we know because we bounce our ideas off of one another. And in that process, we actually create knowledge. But communication from a technical perspective has a lot of different variables that I think people overlook. And we can talk about those as well. I think that each of them are relevant for a new perspective on what communication really is.
And I'd like to dive into that, but you used one word in that explanation that really struck me, and that was the word exchange. And in that, if that communication or that messaging is going to occur, there has to be some type of an exchange, which means something that's given and received and then given back, it would seem. And so, am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. So in 1948, there was the action model of communication. It was very, it's linear, it's one direction. You have a speaker and they send a message to a receiver. So already we have a few variables, a sender, a receiver, and a message. The problem is in 1948, there was no feedback. So in 1955, there was a new model, the cyclical model, where a sender would send a message to a receiver, and then the receiver would then send the message back to the sender. But we know now that that too is incomplete for most face-to-face communication, telephonic communication, video communication, like what we're engaging right now. And so in 1970, scholars developed what they call the transactional model of communication. And in this model, it's a complex model, and you can think of it kind of like a car engine. But it's a complex model where you have two participants. They're no longer sender and receiver because they are both at the same time sending and receiving messages. Those messages go across a channel. They are interfered with by noise. So noise can be environmental, like sounds outside, or they can be psychological sounds inside. We have encoding and decoding, which is the breaking down of messages and also the construction of messages. You have the process of feedback. You also have context and frame of reference. A lot is going on.
I actually think I'm going to interrupt you. I want to pursue that further, but I think we have a graphic of that transactional model that would like to, if the guys can put that up, that would be very interesting. And so there are a considerable number of elements that are going on all at the same time based on this model. Yeah?
That's right.
And so anything can interfere with the actual exchange of ideas or whatever that might be attempted.
I think that's right. You don't simply say, well, we're not communicating. You are communicating and you're creating meaning through this whole process. But when you don't have high fidelity or the two parties don't agree, the question is, why don't they agree? Sometimes parties are having a problem encoding a message. We don't know the words to say to express what we're feeling or thinking. That can sometimes be called alexithymia, the inability to find the right word to express your feelings and thoughts. And we all have experienced that.
Right.
You also have decoding. Sometimes we don't understand the words that others are saying. We don't understand the symbols. Maybe we haven't learned them yet, or maybe we're misinterpreting them. And so we don't break down the intended message that was sent. So we give awkward feedback.
I would think too that there's there can be a disconnect between the words that are spoken and the body language that the person is presenting that may appear to be in conflict with the spoken message. Yes?
Absolutely. Scholars often say that you believe the words that people will say, but if the nonverbal communication, all that communication that is not based in words, is not congruent with the spoken word, we're going to choose the nonverbal communication over the verbal communication.
And why is that?
Scholars have their ideas, but really, I think it goes down to the fact that behavior existed before words did.
Ah, okay.
And so there's this historical, maybe evolutionary component to it. Also, we're dealing constantly with deception. So if you say you like something, honey, I like what you're wearing tonight, those are the right words. But if you don't really believe it, you have what we call nonverbal leaks. And your face or your body language will show that you don't really believe it because it makes you feel uncomfortable.
And are we good at picking up those nonverbals as a species?
Yeah, it's funny. Women tend to be better at sensitivity to nonverbal cues than men. Men are very linguistic. We like creating words. We like exchanging symbols for ideas, and we like the arbitrariness of it, and we like to debate about what those words mean. And I think women are probably just more social.
Ah, okay. So you mentioned the word social, so where does social media fit into it? How does that impact our communication activities these days? I mean, everyone is now using text messaging or WhatsApp or Instagram and blah, 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 all sorts of mechanisms that are putting out written word or video or something, but it's not live, shall we say, face-to-face kind of live. How does that impact things?
Yeah, social media and any kind of computer-mediated exchange is really interesting because it can nowadays provide you anonymity.
Yeah,
So
right.
someone who generally is apprehensive about generating a message can hide behind the screen. So they have their username and they can say whatever they want. So we have a lot of people who are very brave that otherwise wouldn't be. On the other hand, because it's permanent, social media has been used in criminal trials to convict perpetrators of certain crimes, or to solve, divorce disputes and whatnot. Now you have people saying, "I'm not going to touch this stuff." So you have a real strained situation in which we're not communicating naturally anymore. That makes it very difficult.
I had the opportunity to do a show several months ago with a woman who's a principal at a local high school, and she was talking about the impact of the social media concept on the interactivity of kids in their teens, the bullying concept and all that sort of stuff. Because like you said, you can sort of be somewhat anonymous. And the generation at that level That's the only thing they know. I mean, they were born with this kind of mechanism for communication. Myself, no. I mean, there wasn't. I mean, the telephone was the big thing, right? You didn't have, if you weren't in front of somebody, you had a chance to use a telephone, or you'd send a telegram, or put a handwritten letter or something. But today, with the social media thing, it's instantaneous and it's easily misinterpreted, I guess. I don't know if people understand that how words can have a variety of meanings, and if they're not, if the sentence is not structured properly, what you think you're going to say can be something entirely different.
That makes sense to me, and I see it with my students. A student will come in, and you can tell them 10, 20 times, do not use your cell phone, but they will absolutely have their cell phone in class. And so I've made it a point now to where if they're on their phone, I will call them out. And they'll say, well, can you repeat the question? And I said, well, I'll repeat the question if you tell me why you're on your cell phone. And so they learn pretty quickly in these, very confrontational but friendly exchanges. Don't use the cell phone in class. Put it away. But they're completely engaged, and some have suggested that there's an increase in dopamine from interacting with people that you want to interact with. And so they feel really good because they're needed, they're liked, they're getting immediate feedback. And again, that's part of the transactional model, is getting that feedback. And there are studies that suggest that there are levels of sensitivity of feedback. So if you have a person who is sensitive, they're going to want that immediate feedback. And so they're going to be glued to their phone. It's important for their maturity to separate them from that, to teach them that it's important to be present, and that face-to-face communication is so much more rich and rewarding than media where we can interact through these digital devices.
But I think people also consider that it's sometimes more dangerous because you have, I have another question for you, but before I ask it, I want to just let the folks who are watching know that this is a topic that is fairly broad and deep. If you have any questions about anything we're talking about, send them in to me at info@referencetv.com. I'll let Danny know, and then we can get these questions answered, so don't forget to do that. I wanted to ask you about your students, and you've been doing this for a number of years now, so what have you observed at the beginning of your course? What are the students like when they start? What's different when they're finished, when they're through the course?
So I teach a variety of courses. I teach the basic speech course, right? How to give a speech. We discuss informative and persuasive speeches. And I have discussed basic communication in that, because before you give a formal presentation, you have to engage with your audience face to face. So there's a very natural component to it. I've also taught a hybrid course called Communicating Effectively in Your Community. This is one of the foundational courses at TCU. I've taught communication ethics. All of these courses, also interpersonal communication, which is more of a theoretical course, but all of these, the students come in highly apprehensive. So a professor named Jim McCroskey, when he was studying communication, apprehension, and anxiety, he developed a measure that asked students generally, or individuals generally, how they feel. And they personally reported their communication apprehension across different fields, such as when you're in a meeting, when you're speaking publicly, interpersonally, or when you're in a small group. And you can get a measure of trait-like apprehension, your willingness or unwillingness to communicate with others. That's a little bit different than public speaking state anxiety, which people think of as stage fright.
Right, right.
So what I see are students who come in that not only have stage fright, like everyone does, which is a trait. I mean, it's a state.
Right.
Instead, they have a trait-like apprehension, an unwillingness to communicate.
Why?
They don't want to speak to anyone.
What is the origin of that type of a thing? That type of a
I think it's probably training. I think it's, McCroskey in his studies, they call it the communibiological theory, that just like the color of your eye, you can't change it. There's nothing you can do about that. And he suggested, and it was very controversial at the time, he suggested that you can't change your level of communication apprehension. So we just have a measure of students and individuals, in life and in the world who have a measure of apprehension. The problem is with that is that they're never going to be encouraged to get out and speak with others. So in my class, I refuse to let the students who don't want to speak sit silent. Every student speaks in every class. I will ask each of them by name to contribute to the discussion somehow. And so it's not a lecture format, it's a discussion. We'll give them some information, then we'll get some feedback. We'll have them meet with one another in groups. Sometimes it's one-on-one. And sometimes it's
what are you
3 or 4
seeing
together.
in the way of results from doing that?
At the end of the course, by being exposed to other students that have similar thoughts about communication and about looking at communication through that transactional model where you see the variables working together, what I see is a new way of looking at communication. They tend to be less apprehensive. So I studied with Dr. Ralph Benke. He was more of a state anxiety expert, and he disagreed with Dr. McCroskey and his idea that you can't change your level of apprehension. And I tend to agree that with Dr. Benke, you can get over your apprehension. You just have to be willing to do it.
From what you described, you've actually seen that to be the case. So, and I can relate to that. That seems to be very reasonable to me. I mean, in many areas of life, you are able to change behavior, change perspective, adapt to in situations in business or family or environmental or whatever. And that's what we are. We're adaptive creatures. And so I would think that that makes a lot of sense that there'd be that possibility. So what can we do in order to help help people kind of like get through this? We got to do something. I mean, how early should this kind of orientation to the eliminating this anxiety element, how early in life should something like that begin?
Oh, it's interesting. I think that it probably does begin with all of us as infants. Generally, what we think of as miscommunication is really just conflict. And the majority of people are trying to avoid conflict at all costs.
Sure.
But it's really unavoidable. It's unavoidable. A conflict is really the actual, real, or perceived incompatibility with goals or shared resources. We're constantly fighting for space, and it's only going to become more common as the world continues to grow in population, and as we continue to increase our density and our closeness in how we communicate with computer-mediated communication. We're going to deal with conflicts over space and resources. So what we need to do is train our children and our adults to be comfortable with conflict. And to consider whether or not diplomacy is right or whether or not we just need to stand our ground. I had one student.
Go ahead.
This is an interesting story. This student said when it comes to conflict, he just doesn't want to speak. And I said, okay, well, we'll call him John. We'll say, John, you're going to dinner. It's an anniversary dinner with your loved one, your special loved one. This is a fantastic anniversary, and you've made reservations in advance. You go to the maitre d', and the maitre d' says, we don't have a table for you. But you can see behind the maitre d' that, well, there's a table right there, and there's no one behind me. So what do you do? And John said, well, I argue. You have to find that moment at which someone is willing to stand up for their right to have their resources.
Okay.
So finding the motivation for each individual is key.
So the concept of conflict, I find, I like that word because it implies to me the need to have some level of interactivity to figure out how you're going to resolve. People are going to have different needs. I mean, I see it in the sales work that I do, right? The different department heads have their own agenda or whatever, you know, or I'm trying to sell something and they want the lowest price and I need to give them, you know, whatever I need to, you know, sell it at whatever price I need to sell it for. And there are these differences of perspective that I guess really is a conflict, and you have to find ways to deal with that and resolve it. And I really appreciate that idea of you have to become comfortable with that kind of a reality. And that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, sure. I don't think that the majority of people are out there trying to conflict. Conflict is simply natural.
Yes.
There are those individuals who are very Machiavellian. There are those, and I've seen this. You know, I also practice law. And in the practice of law, I've seen some people absolutely submarine another person just to win. Yeah. Even though they know that what they're doing is not right. Right. You have to be careful of people. And you have to use discernment to find out which people are trying to take your resources, to undermine your goals. That's key.
Well, this is, I think how do people...
You're speechless.
I'm speechless. So people are going to, I hope a lot of people are going to watch this show and come to the recognition that there is this situation, this reality. So how do we, as individuals, what's our path for learning, for recognizing these concepts that you've talked about and, you know, finding a new methodology or being able to handle these conflict associations and things like that? What do we do? How do I help people?
Well, I think you're doing it right now, right? You have this show where we're having this conversation about things that we're discussing in American universities. Both at St. Edward's University and TCU, we discuss these kind of things. If we can just push them down to high schools and middle schools and provide some practical interaction and not be afraid to have a little theory in it, I think that will be okay. But we've all heard this concept of critical thinking. I think California schools really pioneered the push for critical thinking. And, you know, I was influenced by one of my professors when I was in school to pay attention to the Center for Critical Thinking, which I believe is in Northern California, and how they approach thinking. And Dr. Richard Paul says critical thinking is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to improve your thinking. Okay. And it's funny because now you see that thought is not just one kind of thing. There are different components to your thinking. Yeah. And he often says, after making a knowledge claim, I could be wrong, I often am. Right. Yeah. And he uses that to describe intellectual humility. And if we could teach some intellectual humility where communicators say, well, this is my view of the world, but I could be wrong. Yeah. Now they're open to the other participant to explain to them their point of view. Now we can have this transactional exchange. We need to not just push that down so that the younger generation can see that that needs to be pushed up. Leaders, you know, people in business and industry and you know, and faith-based organizations and politics, etc. It's just like it's necessary because we're all kind of on this same spaceship Earth thing that we've got to deal with, and you know, we got to figure out how to make it how to live together.
What is it that they?
Yeah, that's right.
What was that thing we have to hang together, or we'll definitely hang separately, or something like that? Something.
Yes, I think that's right. You know, I consider this trench warfare, right? Someone takes a position, and they're so locked into their position that they've dug a hole.
Yeah.
And in order to come out of their hole, they have to have some kind of face-saving experience.
Right.
And that's very difficult, right? Once you've painted yourself into a corner, now it takes a lot to get you out of that.
And
so you just end up fighting in the trenches.
That's generally an internal struggle, too. Danny, we're at the point where we have a little over a minute left in the show, so I'm going to ask if you have any parting words that you'd like to share.
You know, I think that what you're doing is great. If we can just learn to communicate more clearly and with a little bit more intellectual humility, I think that we'll all be better for it.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your joining me on the show today. This has been an opportunity for me to talk about this subject that is something I've thought about a lot, but I don't generally have the opportunity to share these ideas. So thank you for the opportunity to be together with you here on the show. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've been enjoying this. And again, as I said earlier, send your queries in. This is a deep and wide topic, and it's something that you need and should take some direct action on. And we're here to help. So thank you for joining us here at Reference Point, and we'll see you next time.